especially thank Johan Swan for inviting me. I came all the way from Montreal, Canada, and I'm very happy to be here. And we were participating in a 3-day meeting about the need to inform future generations, thousands of years into the future, about the radioactive legacy which we are leaving them, which is kind of contradictory to the message the industry sometimes wants to present, that we can forget it. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about is that I think we have to change our thinking about this idea of forgetting it. I think it's wrong, scientifically and ethically, to think that we can forget it. My background, my name is Gordon Edwards. I was a retired professor of mathematics and physics, science really, at Vanier College in Montreal. And I have been a consultant on nuclear issues for over 40 years to both governmental and non-governmental agencies, organizations in Canada. And this is going to be quite a general show. And as a teacher, I tend to take nothing for granted. So if you find some of this stuff that you already would know very well, please forgive me. We're talking about the end of an era here. The nuclear industry is really on the way out. The fission industry as we know it, certainly with the large reactors. It's generally agreed in North America there will never be another large reactor built in North America. Even the people in the nuclear industry are saying this. And certainly in Canada, we have not had a large reactor ordered since 1978. But although the age of nuclear power is winding down, the age of nuclear waste is just beginning. And the age of nuclear waste stretches out before us ominously so far into the future. It's unlike anything the human race has ever dealt with before in terms of a toxic legacy. We've never had to deal with this. When you think that the pyramids of Egypt are only 5,000 years old, that's just such a drop in the bucket compared with the time frames we're talking about here. Now, as you all probably know, a nuclear reactor generates hundreds of new radioactive materials, which did not ever exist in nature prior to 1939. So these materials, these are materials. These materials are completely new in our human environment, and we don't have previous experience with them. And they're created in the reactor core where the uranium fuel is, and the most radioactive of these is the fuel itself, the irradiated nuclear fuel. However, the entire primary cooling system, which circulates water through the core, that entire system becomes contaminated with radioactive materials as well. So the radioactive materials spread outward. By far the most concentrated are in the core. Now, nuclear fission. Excuse me.
I just need to say that the presentations are on the website, because we know that it might be difficult to see the details in here. So that on the website, for the people on the web, they are on the website to download.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Gordon.
That's quite all right. I am not going to be reading these slides. I'm just going to be showing them to you. And it's not necessary to read the details. I think I'm saying the main point. And I have quite a bit of material. I always have too much. So I'll try and go through it a little quickly. But be assured that this material is going to be posted, and you can go back and look at it later. Some of it is certainly way too much to read at the time. Now, nuclear fission, as you know, involves uranium. When a neutron, a subatomic particle, strikes a uranium-235 atom, that atom splits and energy is released. And the results are the broken pieces of the uranium atom, which are called the fission products. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these, probably as many as 1,000 different fission products. We have on my website in Canada, we have 211 of them listed, and that's not a complete list. And these are the fission products. But there are other radioactive materials created besides the fission products, and they are created because of the extra neutrons. When the uranium atom splits, you get extra neutrons given off, and that's why you are allowed to have an ongoing, self-sustaining nuclear reaction, because the one neutron produces 2 or 3, and then that doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles, and so you can have a bomb or you can have a self-sustaining nuclear reaction. But those neutrons, when they hit other materials, they create other radioactive substances too. So there's three different categories of radioactive materials, each one of them counting in the many dozens, if not hundreds. The fission products are one family, and a very important one. There's another family called the actinides, or the transuranic elements. These are elements which are heavier than uranium. These broken pieces are lighter than uranium. They're less massive. But the transuranics, like plutonium and americium and curium and neptunium, those are all heavier than uranium. And then there are other things called activation products, which exist right in the steel and the concrete and the structural materials. Even the water and the air become radioactive as a result of neutron bombardment. The neutrons activate materials in the air and turn them into radioactive elements that did not exist before. Now, in 1978, we had a report on nuclear power in Ontario. Ontario is a large province, and that's where almost all the nuclear reactors in Canada are. There's 22 nuclear reactors in Ontario, and 18 of them are still operating. And this was a report from the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning, but it's specifically focused on nuclear power. And it's called A Race Against Time, which I think is a wonderful title. And it shows that this is what, and this is the front cover you're seeing, by the way. The front cover of the report shows the so-called nuclear fuel chain. You have the uranium ore, which is then milled, and then fuel fabricated into fuel, and then goes into the reactor for fuel. And this is the heavy water. We have heavy water reactors, so we have to produce heavy water for that, which is a naturally occurring non-radioactive material, by the way. And there's the electricity going out. And this is the picture that was given to our decision makers and to the public. For the first 30 years of the nuclear age, most people had no idea that there was such a thing as nuclear waste, because it was clean energy. It was sold as clean energy. So billions of dollars were spent building these reactors on the assumption that there was no problem. It was a lie. Now, whether the industry meant to lie or not is debatable, but it certainly was a lie. And the result is that now our governments are saddled, and the public is saddled with this legacy, which they never knew was being visited upon them. And that's important to remember, that this is founded on a dishonesty at the outset. Then after 30 years in the 1970s, which is when this report was written in 1978, it suddenly became clear that this legacy of radioactive waste was a huge unsolved problem. And this report, like many other similar reports of the time, said unless they solve this problem, they should stop building any more nuclear reactors. By the way, there's been no new nuclear reactors ordered in Canada since this date, 1978. But they said, it's an ultimatum. It's a nuclear ultimatum. Solve the problem or stop producing. And unfortunately, they didn't go far enough to say that not only should you not build new reactors, but you should stop producing the waste. Therefore, you should shut down the old ones too. That was, I think, a mistake. They should have said, we've got to stop producing the waste if we don't know what to do with it. Of course, that doesn't solve the problem, but at least it limits the problem. Now, so here's the back cover of that same report. Where does it go? A wonderful graphic. You turn to the back cover and there's this gigantic question mark. What happens to it? Now, at this point, the industry, having been caught in the initial lie of being clean energy, which is really not clean, embarked upon a second lie. I would call it a lie. And that second lie is, oh yes, nuclear waste. Oh, we forgot to tell you about that, but don't worry about it. We're really looking after it very well. We're keeping it out of the environment. And what's more, we know the solution. We have a solution. So they say we have a solution, which is a lie. They never had a solution. All they had was an idea. And the idea was that we can put it underground and walk away from it and forget it. And they figured that through technology, we can use our ingenuity to ensure that it will stay there forever, forever and ever. Now, the human race has never successfully disposed of anything. You know, poison gas from the First World War came bubbling up in the Black Sea many years later. We had toxic blobs that were from the Dow chemical industry. They deep injection into the ground, permanent disposal, came up in the middle of the St. Clair River as toxic blobs of the sediment. And we've had many examples of disposal, quote unquote, disposal options, which turned out to be horror stories later on. So what makes us think as humans that we know how to dispose of anything, let alone this material? But the industry started with the premise, and this is the opposite of good science, by the way. They start with the premise that we have a solution. And now the question is, how do we prove it? And as they've tried to prove it, they have run into problem after problem after problem after problem. In North America, for example, in the United States, they have had 8 separate attempts to find a geological disposal for high-level radioactive waste, and they have failed all 8 times. 8 out of 8 times they've failed. We've now heard of underground repositories in Germany, the Acetu salt mine and Morsleben, which are not functioning properly, and which are now spending billions of dollars and taking 30 years of effort to take the radioactive waste out of the mine. This is not even the high-level waste. This is intermediate and low-level waste. So the point here is that disposal is not even a scientifically defined word. There is no scientific definition for disposal. And what we're really talking about is abandonment. That's what we're talking about. The industry wants to abandon this waste because they want to cut their losses. They want to cut their liability. And the regulatory agency also wants to abandon the waste because they want to limit their responsibility. So they both have the motivation to try and say, yes, we want to draw the line and get rid of this stuff and say, that's it, we're finished. So presumably, when everything is done and when all of the closure has happened, they will say a scientific Hail Mary and walk away from it. But that doesn't mean they've solved the problem. It means they hope. It's wishful thinking. But it's wishful thinking at a very high level with a lot of good science behind it, but it's not a scientific conclusion. Now, as you know, this waste is so radioactive that it has to be cooled in Canada for at least 10 years in a pool. And you have all your spent fuel here in Sweden in pools. Why? Well, because if you don't circulate water past this waste, it will spontaneously overheat and give off radioactive gases and vapors into the air and damage itself. Why is that? It's because the radiation is a form of energy. Radioactivity is a form of energy, and that energy turns into heat, as all energy does. And so the temperature, if you don't continually remove the temperature, it's not because the fuel is so very hot. It's not actually that hot. But if you don't remove it all the time, the temperature will go up and up and up and up. And so when you put it underground, for example, those temperatures are going to go very high down there in those underground repositories. It's not inert material. It's active material. And that's the problem. For example, this is a picture from Canada, from the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, which is the agency which created the CANDU reactor on behalf of the government of Canada. And after 70 years, they say if you put the waste underground, those horizontal lines are supposed to be underground rock layers. And the red is the hot radioactive waste. And what happens if you put it after 70 years of cooling on the surface? If you put it underground after 70 years, this is what happens after 4,400 years. The heat has nowhere to go, so it spreads through the rock. This is what it looks like after 8,800 years. The heat spreads through the rock, and this is an active process. They say that the temperatures, this goes on for other charts, by the way, which terminate after about 50,000 years. And they call this 50,000 year period where the temperature eventually returns to approximately normal, which is about twice the original temperature that was there. They say that's called the thermal pulse, the heat pulse. You know what a pulse is? It's like a little blip on a radar screen. And they call it a blip on the radar screen because it is a blip on the radar screen when you look at the toxicity. The toxicity goes much further. Here's an advertisement from a Canadian nuclear industry man saying, small wonder, he's holding up a simulation of a fuel pellet from a nuclear reactor. That's a uranium fuel pellet, but it's probably not. It's just a model. But and in fact, if you had a uranium fuel pellet, you could hold it like that. It's not going to hurt you really, because it gives off a fairly non-penetrating form of radiation very, very slowly. It's not going to hurt you really if you just have limited exposure to it, although you should be wearing gloves. But if that fuel is put into the reactor and comes out of the reactor, that same pellet you have to keep an eye on it for the next 10 million years. You can't throw that pellet away. The reason he's calling small wonder is he's saying, isn't it wonderful that you can get as much heat from this pellet as from a whole train carload of coal? And it's right, it's true. But you can't throw it away again. You have to look after it for the next 10 million years. And what's more, if that had come out of a reactor after being in the reactor, this man would be dead. Because one of these bundles in front of him here, these are called the CANDU fuel bundles. They're much shorter than your fuel elements here in Sweden. You have very, very long fuel elements. Ours is just about the size of a fireplace log. One of those fuel bundles coming right out of the reactor would kill any human being in 20 seconds just because of the blast of gamma radiation. Nobody would survive unless they were heavily shielded. So that's why you have to put this stuff underwater. This is why it has to be handled only by robotic equipment. It could never be handled by human hands again, except after maybe 1,000 years. It would be, you could actually handle it then for brief periods of time. That's because the radioactivity does die down, but it doesn't disappear. So what is radioactivity? Well, a radioactive atom is an unstable atom, unlike most of the atoms around us. We do have radioactive atoms that occur in nature. There's a handful of them, but really most of the atoms in this table and in this floor and in this room, most of them are stable. And those same atoms have been around in the time of the dinosaurs without any change. They haven't changed at all. They've just been recombining and so on. A radioactive atom doesn't have an eternal lifetime. It changes, it explodes, it disintegrates. And when it disintegrates, it gives off shrapnel, you might call it. It gives off particles of energy, which is called atomic radiation. And it's at the moment of disintegration that it does damage to biological living cells, because it damages the DNA. It causes random chemical breakage of molecular chain. And if those molecules happen to be your DNA molecule or molecules in your body, that can be ordinary biological reproduction will take that tiny bit of damage and magnify it over a period of time. So perhaps 10, 20, 30 years later, you may get a fatal or unfatal cancer as a result of damage caused much, much earlier at the submolecular level. And there are three types of emissions that are normally talked about. They're called alpha, beta, and gamma. It's important to understand these because they're quite different. Alpha and beta are particles. They're charged particles traveling very fast, and they have relatively little penetrating power. And they're actually quite difficult to detect unless you're very careful. We've had workers, 500 workers in Ontario were contaminated with breathing alpha-emitting dust, radioactive dust, over a period of almost 3 weeks, and it never set off any alarms. They went home, they came back to work, they went home, they came back to work. 3 weeks later, they discovered that they had been breathing radioactive dust all that time. And this stuff is now in their lungs and will be in their lungs for the rest of their lives. It's plutonium dust from the reactor, and it's very hard to detect. The only way you can detect it is not with a radiation monitor, but by taking air samples and taking them to the laboratory and studying them. We also had other workers way back in the 1990s who were contaminated with a dust called carbon-14 dust. And again, you can't measure it with a Geiger counter, really. You have to, and they discovered after weeks that these men had been carting it back to their homes, mostly men. And they had to go and confiscate the bed sheets and furniture as radioactive waste. Now, this is a picture of a cloud chamber and a lump of uranium ore. You can't see radiation or detect it with your senses, but here you can see the tracks left by them because of condensation, like vapor trails. So when you put a rock, if you looked at that rock, it would just look like an ordinary rock. but you see that it's constantly giving off these radioactive emissions. Radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off. We have no way, there's no scientific way to shut off radioactivity. That's why we have a radioactive waste problem. We don't know how to shut it off. We don't know how to speed it up or slow it down or change the rate of disintegration at all. Science has no power over that. That's why when you shut down a nuclear reactor, it still can melt down. Why? Because you can't shut off the radioactivity. And because you can't shut off the radioactivity, that radioactivity provides enough heat to melt the fuel at 3,800 degrees Celsius. And when it melts at that temperature, that's twice the melting point of steel. Now, pollution from the nuclear fuel chain will enter the food chain because these are material things. Don't think of invisible rays. Think of material objects, material particles, and there's hundreds of varieties. So they all have their own pathways through the environment and through the human body, and they cause a lot of damage. They're damaging to nearby living cells. That's why nuclear waste is a public health problem. In fact, different radioactive materials will go to different parts of the body. Now, let's just, this is a 10 million year diagram from that same report I was showing you earlier, talking about the radiotoxicity over 10 million years. It's interesting that the total toxicity, which is the blue line, actually goes up after about 50,000 years. It actually increases again. Not back up to where it was originally, but over where it was at the low point here. And that's because of changes that are going on in the waste. Now, I want to fast forward because I'm running out of time. Oh, I must say something about this. This is one of the ways in which heavier than uranium atoms are created. When a uranium-238 atom absorbs a neutron, it turns into plutonium-239. And that's how heavier than uranium elements are created. These are very, very toxic, but what makes them even particularly dangerous is they can be used to make atomic bombs. In fact, this is one of the primary nuclear explosives in the world. And because plutonium-239 has a half-life of 10,000 years, it means that when you put the waste underground, you are actually creating a plutonium mine. Anybody 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 30,000 years from now could go and dig that up and use that plutonium to make atomic bombs. Plutonium does not exist in nature. There is no such thing as a plutonium mine except the ones that we create. And the ones that we create is because we bury the radioactive waste that contains the plutonium. So this is how much plutonium was in the Nagasaki bomb. That's the amount of plutonium that was used to destroy the city of Nagasaki. So in the total inventory of this spent fuel, you have enough for thousands of atomic bombs, and you will have for a very long time to come. So there's two monumental untruths. Number one, nuclear energy is clean. There's no toxic waste. And then, number two, we have a permanent solution to nuclear waste. It is safe to abandon it and forget it. Both quite untrue. The facts are there are hundreds of radioactive poisons with distinct biological pathways. And if we go down to the bottom here, there are three notable failures that I've already mentioned to you. The US has tried 8 times to locate a disposal site. Germany has 2 failed underground repositories. And in America, they had an underground repository where there was a single drum that exploded, and plutonium dust went vertically upwards 750 meters to the surface. It contaminated 22 workers and then drifted downwind to contaminate the town of Carlsbad, New Mexico. 750 meters upwards, amazing. And it took $2 billion approximately to clean up that facility enough to allow them to begin to start putting more waste down there. And we don't know how many more barrels are likely to undergo that explosion. The reason it exploded, by the way, is because one of the things radiation does, atomic radiation, is because it breaks chemical bonds, it makes chemical reactions that are abnormal. So chemical reactions which are unanticipated, that you did not expect. And that produces sometimes, in this case, it produced a flammable gas, which built up the pressure and the heat. And when the drum exploded, it turned into a flamethrower and very violent. Now I want to talk about the rolling stewardship concept. Our organization, Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, is advocating that we should stop thinking about abandonment. abandonment is both unscientific and unethical. We have to think of rolling stewardship going forward, which means we don't have a solution to the abandonment of nuclear waste. But although I handed this out to you so that I don't have to read it to you, but these are 5 points that were formulated by the Indigenous peoples of Ontario, the Anishinaabe Nation and the Iroquois Caucus, representing approximately 60 different First Nations communities in Ontario, all over the province. And these are very wise pieces of advice. We should not abandon this stuff. It has to be monitored and retrievable at all times so that we can take corrective action if necessary. It has to be better contained and better packaged so that future generations can deal with it better. It has to be away from major water bodies, because water is, of course, the lifeblood of living things. And if you contaminate that, you've really poisoned our livelihood. And finally, there should not be transportation of this waste except in exceptional circumstances. So unlike abandonment, which leads to amnesia, that's what abandonment leads to. It leads to amnesia. It means that future generations are going to be completely on their own hook and not know how to deal with this stuff. If you don't have the right equipment, you can't even detect radiation. Our 5 senses do not detect it. So they won't even know what hit them. We have to communicate to future generations, and that's what the 3-day meeting that took place here in Stockholm was all about. How do we pass this information along thousands of years into the future? Because we don't have a solution. The idea that we have a solution is a fiction. It's an industrial fiction. We have to wake up to the fact that maybe we will have a solution. It's only been 75 years. We may have a solution in 100 years or 200 years. We may be able to actually destroy this stuff. I'll give you an example. If Star Trek was here with Captain Kirk, and we could put it into the transporter booth and send it without safely into the center of the sun, it would be gone. If we knew how to do that safely, that would be an actual solution. But we don't have a solution. What we have is another storage method, but it's by no means guaranteed that this is going to work over such enormous time periods. So into eternity, we eventually have no transparency, no education, no consultation, no alternatives, no remediation, because there's nobody home. That's what happens if we abandon it. We're really committing a terrible injustice to future generations. So our proposal is that we have a new nuclear waste policy based on frankness. We begin by admitting that we have no solution. That's the starting point. And because we have no solution, it will have to be monitored and retrievable for the foreseeable future. That means centuries at least, probably, unless we come up with some magic solution along the way. The waste have to be packaged safely for extended periods and labeled properly so that future generations will know what's in it, and repackaged later, ready to be repackaged. We know how to keep this stuff out of the environment. We've been doing that. But we can't just then abandon it and say, okay, now you're going to look after yourself. We have to continue to look after it and be prepared to repackage it when necessary. So rolling stewardship is needed until a genuine solution is found, and we don't know when that's going to be or if that's ever going to be. Rolling stewardship is based on not on amnesia, but on the persistence of memory. And this leads to a lot of discussion that we've had already about methods of communicating over such long periods of time. One of the things that we have talked about in our organization is having a kind of an authority, which is not the nuclear industry. This has got to be taken out of the hands of the nuclear industry. There has to be a civil authority which has the resources and the authority to look after this waste, not just to guard it and the status quo, but to actually improve as much as possible. Improve if you can, so that the next generation can do better than we've done in keeping this stuff out of the environment. And don't stop looking for a solution. You got to keep looking for a solution, but we don't have one yet. And this 20-year cyclic reviews, we talked quite a bit about this in the last 3 days at this meeting. And one of the things we said is it should be ceremonial. There should be a changing of the guard kind of ceremony and public education of why it's important to look after this material. There could be music, there could be celebrations, there could be dance, there could be reenactments, dramatizations to communicate to the next generation the importance of protecting ourselves from this legacy. And it doesn't have to be terribly expensive, but you have to accumulate resources so that when you do need to take action, those resources will be there. So each generation will have to contribute a little bit to the resources to build it up. So I'm just going to thank you very much for your attention. And I want to close with this final picture, which was one of many pictures taken by my good friend Robert Del Tredici. This is a picture of young women from the Kazakhstan region, right near the Mayak plant, which is where they reprocessed spent fuel to extract the plutonium in order to build Joseph Stalin's atomic bombs. And these women have just found out for the first time that the sickness that has been plaguing their village for all these years, many, many years, is due to the fact that the Soviets dumped high-level radioactive liquid waste right into the Techa River. And the river flows right by there, and they have been drinking this water and getting sick. And the doctors were forbidden to use the word radiation in talking to people. They were told to call it vegetative illness. Vegetative illness. And so they didn't want people to know what it really was. And that's the problem with amnesia. Amnesia means you are terribly victimizing these people. So thank you very much. And that is the end of my presentation.